Today, Emil Wilson joins me on the Writing Coach podcast. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. This is great.
Now, I absolutely want to dig into your new book, The Nightingales, with you. But first, on this show, I interview folks who work with authors, help them excel. And a couple years back, you worked on a book called How to Write a Novel in 20 Pies. So can you tell the listeners a little bit about that project?
That was a project that I worked on with a writer named Emil Wilson, and she had this program in San Diego where she would do writing seminars, and she would serve pies. And she wanted to create a book that broke down the writing process and, also had recipes. And it was this really interesting way to combine two of her favorite hobbies, which were, not even hobbies. She's a professional writer, not a professional baker, but she combined writing with something that she loved, which was baking pies. And so I did all the illustrations, and, it was a great project.
So I know The Nightingales is your first official book.
Yes.
Was it already in the works at that point, or were there any lessons learned working on that project about how to write a book that then led to you working on The Nightingale?
Well, I did make a lot of pies while I was working on that book. So that skill set definitely developed pretty well. I had started the book as a thesis project. I went to the Center for Cartoon Studies in Vermont, and I had just graduated when I was working on that book. So I had started it. I took a couple of years off to family stuff. I had a parent who was sick, and so I didn't work on it. I didn't work on the Nightingales. I worked on the pie book instead. And so when I came back to it, I definitely had a better sense of, how to think about story and how to think about character. And so I guess it did benefit in the long run. I hadn't thought about that, but it really had.
So I read the book today, which means I spent most of the afternoon crying. So thank you very much for that. Incredible book, especially if we're going to say this is your first book. Incredible work here. One of your testimonials says it deserves to stand alongside Fun Home, and I don't think you could ask for a much better.
Yeah, that's bonkers. That's one of those things that that was a surprise when I read that. I was incredibly grateful.
So the book, I believe, officially gets released the first week of August.
Correct.
So it's not out there in the world yet, but obviously you're getting this feedback already. I hope you're pleased with the project. How incredible does it feel to be getting the kind of feedback you've been getting on it?
Yeah, I think I'm being punked every time somebody sends me those comments, because I'm just like, this can't be true. And then I sit at my laptop for like 20 minutes and cry, and then get back to work. So it's, you've been through a lot of workshops. Sometimes you workshop stuff and you're like, oh, I think this works. And people are like, it doesn't work. And there are sometimes you put some work out there and people are like crying. And you think, oh, this is better than I thought it was. I thought the book was good. I'm really proud of it. And I worked really hard on it. But I think there's always this moment of surprise when somebody really likes it. I think I'm still sort of at that place where I'm just happy that they were reading it. And the fact that they liked it just seems like extra gravy. So yeah, I guess hopefully I'll get used to feeling like people like it, but I'm not there yet. I hope I'm not, because I think it makes everything feel really special.
Well, it is a special book. It
Thanks.
is powerful, emotional, and beautiful.
Thank you.
Interesting thing, though, you could call it a graphic novel, but there's no panels. It's literary memoir, only it isn't memoir. Have you found it challenging to present it to audiences as a single thing? Do you get a lot of, what is this?
Interestingly, the people who have those kind of questions are people who make graphic novels. I think that, and I couldn't have asked I mean, this is kind of what I had hoped for, was that, you know, I didn't grow up reading comics. I didn't make comics. I just you know, in my younger life, I just started a few years ago, and so my orientation is not to comics. And I think that because my background is in something else, which happens to be advertising and design and graphic design and commercials and posters and that kind of stuff, I think that my approach to this book was not as a comic artist, but as somebody who's like, this is just what I like, and hopefully someone else will like it. And I think that that's, to get back to what we were talking about a moment ago, I think that's why I'm always a little surprised, is because it doesn't look like a comic, and yet that's the thing that people seem to warm to about it, and I couldn't be happier about that. So, um, yeah, I'm really pleased with the reception that people have had, and especially, you know, if there's any takeaway I have to this book, it's that people, you know, I mean, I didn't grow up reading comics, like I said, and I think that I was always under the impression that, you know, graphic novels were comics and comics were for teenagers, either superheroes or, you know, how to get your be feeling stressed about having braces and acne. And I love reading those books. I just don't really have a connection to them, even though I had braces and I had acne 50 years ago. But I guess I wanted to make a book that just felt more adult, and I wanted to write about my family and the dysfunction in the family. And I think that those aren't necessarily subject matters for books for a teenager, but I'm really proud of the fact that it feels like it's an adult novel.
Your design experience obviously comes through
Right.
in this graphic storytelling, but I'm curious, what about your marketing background comes through, if anything, in the way you tell this story?
I think when you sort of compare advertising to comics, they both do two things that are very similar, which is they have a little bit of time and a little bit of space to do a lot of work visually. And I think that if you've ever designed like a billboard where you have a second to get someone's impression, to tell them this is the product, this is what it does, and this is what you should do to either buy it or, you know, donate to it or whatever the strategy is, I think that you understand quickly that you have to be very economical with the visual language that you're choosing, the headline that you're writing, which shouldn't be more than like 5 or 6 words. And I think all of that trickles down to comics to make the story visual and having the visuals do the work. I think that there's this impression sometimes that comics are illustrations. And I think that illustrations are slightly different in that illustrations are a picture of what you've been reading. And I think in comics, there's a move that the picture should do work that the words aren't doing. So that those two things are in conversation, and that conversation create those parts create a whole. That is absolutely true with what happens in advertising, that, you know, the headline should do one thing, the visual should do something else, and those two things together should have a final sort of feeling message, and that conversation is what the product is.
Early in the book, there's a bit of a thesis statement, at least for the form of the thing, where the narration says, "I've always felt like memory felt like a sketchbook."
Right.
Was that the starting point for this project? Was it always going to be this sort of sketchbook multimedia approach to the storytelling?
Yeah, I'm actually really glad you asked that. You're actually the first person in conversation and in any kind of promotion that has asked that, and I'm so proud of that. I'm not proud that you asked it. I'm just proud that I that it's in the book. But it did start there. I think that, you know, one of the things that you do in graphic design is that you try to find a visual language to sort of enhance the message. And I kept thinking, you know, here's this book on memory, and what does memory look like? How would memory sort of be sitting on a page? And I've always been fascinated by artist sketchbooks. I mean, I love art, but I think that what a sketchbook does that's different is that it's expressive. There's mistakes. There are things that are sort of half started and then not finished. And I sort of feel like that's the way memory kind of comes through, that you remember something really detailed, but you don't remember the room that it happened in. Or I feel like I'm always like I remember the expression on my parents' faces during a conversation, but I have no idea what we were talking about. But I remember that expression. And I think that sort of chaotic, unspontaneous sort of way that it's generated feels like memory, and that feels like a sketchbook. And so those things sort of felt like I wanted to use it from the beginning. It was one of the first things I did.
Whenever I'm looking at illustrated art, especially something like the sketchbook nature to this, as you said, some images are more polished than others.
Hmm.
And as a writer, I don't as much have that option. I kind of a
You
sentence
don't.
looks like a sentence, and so when I'm talking to artists, I'm always like, "How do you decide that you were going to draw a perfectly detailed hand on this page
Right.
and do like four squares for fingers on this
Yeah.
page? In this project, it's almost every page you're making those kinds of decisions. How
Yeah.
do you go about making those choices?"
Like I said, some of it's just spontaneous. One thing that was sort of interesting that I had not counted on when making this book is that, and I've talked to other graphic novelists that on their first book this was the case, is that you become a better artist in the process of making the book. So when I went back to edit it with my editors, I was a better artist because I had finished the book, and then you go to the beginning and you're like, oh, these drawings are rough. Like these are rough. And it felt really important to kind of keep the integrity of those first drawings being rough, because I think that if somebody was making this sketchbook, which is sort of the idea behind the book, is that they too would become a better artist. But it made drawing at the beginning of the book, like editing and making new drawings for the beginning of the book, a little challenging because you wanted to match what was around you. But after a while your eye starts to be like, oh, I'm good at drawing, and I can draw a better face than I did on page 20. On page 400 I'm better here. So that was a bit of a discovery.
Well, I'll let you know, novelists go through the exact same thing
That's fantastic.
every time. By the time you get to the end of a draft, you're so much better. You know the characters so much better. You're writing stronger. And then you go back to the next draft and you're like, what was I doing? And it's this
Yeah.
perpetual thing where you're always improving. And thus the beginning never quite as polished as the end. But I think, as you
it
said, there's some rawness to it that can be powerful too.
I think because they're pictures, it feels a little bit more like it's obvious. And maybe to me, I think that the writing feels like you like the story better, and you're sort of generating, you sort of have momentum in the same way that the skill of the writer does. But I think that when it comes to art, you're like, oh, this drawing, I can see this drawing is better. So it feels it's a process. It's a process.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you approached color in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to, I mean, I think about color. But I think I think maybe because of my age, and maybe because I haven't spent a lot of time. I mean, I've illustrated in my life, but this is a new sort of direction for the work that I was doing. I tend to still be a little bit of a 5-year-old at the art table, where it's like, oh, I like this color, and today I've got the pencil, and oh, I don't like the pencils right now. I'm going to use watercolor. And I think that spontaneousness, I think that spontaneity of the materials and how you approach them, and not feeling that I have to do something artful, that I can just kind of experiment and play around, also, which helps. The sketchbook forgives that sin too. Like the sketchbook does a lot of forgiving. I think that one of the other things with the sketchbook is I'm not especially good drawing character design so that this person looks the same from page to page to page. And yet in a sketchbook, nobody looks the same. I mean, no portrait looks the same from page to page to page. So I thought, great, this is a system I've put into place to cover up all the things I'm bad at. Which, again, I know writers do the same thing, and I think that that's just part of the game of learning your skill levels and talent. So, in terms of color, I think that it's just very spontaneous. I tend to go, I want to be a brooding artist, but I just like bright colors. So it all looks like someone's like, your palette is kind of candy colored. And I'm like, I think that that's kind of an accident, and then maybe not an accident. I think that's just my natural way to sort of paint things. So, yeah.
what really jumped out at me was it's certainly lush in color, but there's also a restraint to it. There's certain pages that might
Right.
be monochromatic, but then I won't spoil anything. But near the end of the book, there's a spread um, with a nightingale in it, and it really feels like visually the most colorful of the entire book.
Right.
And I think there's perhaps a rainbow element in there as well, which
Mhm.
obviously plays into the storytelling. So I don't know. I felt like there's some really nice restraint until the moment to unleash the rainbow, and I felt like you chose the kind of perfect moment to do that.
Oh, thanks. I think I think that some of that was conscious. I think that some of that was just this sort of exuberant feeling of the ending of just sort of, you know, the realization of who this character is, and sort of the realization that she has gone on this journey, and we've gone on the journey with her in terms of reading the book. So I felt like that was part of that. I think that there's a lot of gay and lesbian LGBTQ themes in the book. I think that, the colors all sort of feel really basic and bright, which all sort of lead into the rainbow as well. So I think that that's something that I think maybe I did consciously and maybe a little unconsciously. So,
Right. This book could be seen if someone just picked it up and start reading it, they might think it was a memoir from somebody
mhm,
blue, perhaps. However,
right.
your name is on the front cover, and
Mhm,
there's reference to a brother early on in the book, but your name does not appear until page 100, I believe. We're 100
right.
pages, and then suddenly the author's name drops into the story. And eventually, you or a version of you does put in an appearance. But tell me
Right.
about this process of writing a story that's clearly influenced by your family and yet not having you be the POV character.
Right. And this is a really fascinating question to have and a conversation to have with somebody who is a writer and teaches writing, is that, one of the things, I mean, I wrote a memoir many years ago that I ended up not publishing. And one of the things that I discovered when I was workshopping it was, with memoir, there's always this feeling, or these comments of like, you need to go deeper. You need to just go deeper. And there was a point where I was like, I don't know that there's anywhere deeper to go. Like, I feel like I'm as deep as I can go. And people just kept saying, no, you need to go further. And that just felt really frustrating to me. And so when it was time to write this book, I was like, I don't want to deal with any of that. I don't want to deal with like, you're not going deeper. I want to deal with my family, who I know intimately and would know as characters what they would do in any given situation. But I don't want to self-analyze. Like, I just want to analyze them, which is both freeing and maybe a little mean. Like, I think that my family's like, why are we the ones that you're gonna, you know, make this story about? But I had met, the scene that the brother comes in, and the brother is based on me, is true, in that I came home and I met this gentleman who was living with my family, and I wanted to insert the brother into the story because I felt like he kind of like he sort of like is sort of like this shadow character, and I just thought, I just feel like that's not fair to the reader. I need to sort of bring him in, see how the other people react to him, and then get him out. And fortunately, that's kind of what had really happened, so that was easy to do. It was interesting, choosing to make the characters people who I knew really well, because I felt like I knew enough that they were great characters, that I could feel like the freedom to move around on the chessboard, so to speak. But I didn't have to feel like there was going to be somebody in a workshop that was like, you need to go deeper with these people, because I was going as deep as I knew to go. So I don't know. Is that fair to say to like somebody who deals with
I think
memoir and
so.
writers?
I mean, I'd be curious, was there ever a moment where the character wasn't going to have your name? Were you like because the second you name the character after
Sure.
yourself, there is a certain level of intertextuality that becomes
Oh,
unavoidable.
for sure. And I think that one of the great things about having a really odd name is that this was the one time where I felt like, oh, I'm going to have this odd name that I've been fighting with since I was a child. I'm going to have it work for me in ways that I didn't even know I could reward myself with. So, none of the none of the people in the book, I've changed the name of every member in my family, but I just thought, here's one name that will somebody's going to put together. This name is the one that's on the cover, and uh, yeah, I thought it worked to great effect.
We've talked about color and we've talked about
Hmm. Yeah,
illustration a bit. Um, I wonder if we can touch on composition. I'm thinking
sure.
particularly of a certain double page spread in the book where the majority of the verso left hand page is blank and the right hand
Mhm.
page shows a hospital bed.
Yep.
I found it profoundly powerful. Could you tell me a little bit about the process or the choices that went into creating that image?
Yeah, well, in general, I think that in terms of composition, I think that that's where the advertising background came in because I think that unlike comics, it's interesting talking to comic artists about their composition because it's so ingrained in the panel and grid system that where your focal point falls seems like it's always oriented to the center of the page. And what was interesting is that in advertising, that's never the case. It's kind of like this is the page, and I'm going to sort of tell you where to go here. And so, in terms of the composition of that page specifically, I knew that because I had experienced, because that is a moment in the book that I had experienced personally, even though it happens to the teenage daughter, most of the back third of the book is taken from my experience. This is semi-autobiographical in that pretty much everything in the book happens, who it happened to, and the order that it happens. That's something I played with. So I had worked as a buddy for GMHC in New York for Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York as a buddy for people with AIDS. And I had worked with one particular client. I was 22. And again, we had this really wonderful friendship that we had that was similar to the friendship that, my father and my sister had with the man that had moved into us. And I just kind of took those two narratives and kind of stitched them together, streamlined them. But I knew that the moment that I had come into the hospital in St. Vincent's in New York and he had passed in the night, and the nurse had said, I'm sorry, he passed. And my first thought was, oh, he passed his blood test and he's probably waiting for me downstairs in the lobby. Was just this moment of like, oh, the realization that this person has died. And I think that when you're 22, mortality is a relatively abstract concept that you don't really know how to grasp. Most 22-year-olds are like, what do you mean he died? That's crazy. Nobody dies. And as you get older, you realize that everybody dies. It's just you're 22 and you don't know better. And so I wanted to sort of have that moment of realization figure into the composition of the page where everything kind of slides to one side and when you have those moments, reality is kind of tilted on its edge, and you're thinking like, how do I, how do I make sense of this? And I think that she's going through that. I went through that, and I think the visual on the page kind of helps that thought along.
I think it's a beautiful example of how graphic storytelling can incorporate silence or nothingness into storytelling. In
That's
music,
nice.
we use pauses all the time,
Yeah,
right? But
sure.
unfortunately, as novelists, I work with so many writers and they'll say something like, it felt like we were in slow motion or the room was
Hmm.
completely silent, but neither of those things communicate the feeling of it being in
Right.
slow motion or if they're actually being silenced. And so just thought it was a very very beautiful
It's
storytelling technique to
it's
use.
interesting when you make a graphic novel. One of the things that I discovered in the many things that I discovered is that there are times when it feels much more akin to filmmaking than it does to writing, in that when you do a film, you think constantly about how the viewer is seeing it. Like, what are they seeing? Like, what's the angle and how are you talking about because you don't have the ability to use words in film, in terms of narration, telling what's happening on the inside of a person can be a little challenging. That's especially true in graphic novels because if you don't want to use narration, there's really no thing outside of action, and you don't have performance like you do in film. So you have to figure out ways to sort of understand, oh, that's how she's feeling at this moment. And that's always a bit of a challenge sometimes if you don't have the ability to have 3 pages of description. So,
You mentioned you didn't grow up in comics.
right.
I did. So I come from the superhero world and I kind of love bad guys and whatnot.
Mhm.
And so I'm curious, giving Annie Marie her scenes with the religious figure, Virgin Mary, right?
Yes.
If those scenes did exist, we could view that character as like pure bad guy evil.
Right. Right.
Um, what was why humanize her? Why not have her be a comic book bad guy?
Well, well, there are a lot of reasons. One is I think that it's interesting. I think that in one of the first drafts of this book, I mean the Virgin Mary was always there, sort of as a an ability to kind of have her reveal her character, and I think that that was really good to sort of understand what she's thinking. And we know that it's a fantasy because she's talking to the Virgin Mary, and the Virgin Mary doesn't exist. So it wasn't like there was like, oh, this is a. I mean, it was clear it was fantasy, and it was clear that she was generating this. I think, I there was somebody in a workshop, which is shows the value of workshops, that someone said, I think the father is the problem here, that the father has made this decision unilaterally for his family. And here's this woman who doesn't seem like she has a vote. And she is, of course, she's not angry. She's just really frustrated that she's not being listened to. And it was one of those workshop comments, and they come around, there occasionally a workshop comment will just make you go like, oh my gosh, like I'm not only reassessing this character, I'm reassessing my mother. and and I think that it was really helpful, especially when you have to create a backstory for this character, to understand, you know she is a product of growing up in the very post-war, in a very patriarchal family. She was an attractive young woman who was constantly told, like, you don't have to worry about anything, you'll have a man take care of that for you. And then she was a woman who, was in her 30s when the feminism movement hit, and suddenly she's like, well, those people don't really represent me, and this doesn't represent me, so what are my choices? I have no choices. And it was great to sort of have a comment that made me sort of open up that window and think, oh, I've got this character not so much wrong. She's not bad, but I have to make the badness clear as to what it really, like, I have to explain what this really is. And that was really, from a writing point of view, that was really helpful.
Yeah, while reading those scenes, what really struck me was her loneliness. I had this moment where I was like, she's talking to an imaginary person and she has
Right.
to talk.
Right. Yeah.
That was very sad. But then, by the end of the book, I was no longer on her side. And let's actually talk about that without giving any spoilers.
Sure.
This is a book about a man, well, or part of the book is about a man suffering from AIDS, and
Hmm.
obviously, at the time that this is set, there wasn't a lot of happy endings to those stories,
Right.
and so there's some very, very sad moments in this book, and you made me cry several times, as I said, and so we get this loss, we get this sadness, and then we enter the final portion of the book in which you hit the reader with a gut punch that I did not see coming a million miles away.
Oh, well, that's great.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do, of
Yeah.
course. Yeah.
So, as someone who studies story structure, who talks about structure all the time, we
Hmm.
often have these all is lost moments at the 75% mark, or we have this kind of high tower surprise during the climax. But this, like, break your reader down, let them start to think they're getting better, and then break them again. Kind of really caught me off guard. Where did that idea come from? I can't think of a lot of other stories where I see that technique used.
Well, I thank you so much. I don't know that I don't know what technique it is, but I'll tell you where it came from, which is when I first was conceiving the book, and I was, excuse me, talking to my sister. Um, I had said, look, I don't know how this. There are some things at the ending of the story that I don't really know what happened. And I said, so what happened to all of these things that he sort of introduced into the household? And she says, I don't know. I mean, it sort of these things just sort of disappeared. And I just thought, well, this is kind of this is where my head goes with it. And she's like, well, that's nothing. That's not a scenario that she's like, that's a scenario that we've all considered. That's not out of the realm of possibility. And that was just enough, again, because it was a novelization of something that had really happened. It was almost like there was permission to be like, great, I don't need to talk about this anymore. I'm going to just take this and run for the hills and do what I think is right for the story. And I think that there were some things that happened for me as a young man after college, just as college was ending, where I think that my parents were wonderful people. I think that they made some bad parenting choices based in how they were brought up. And I think that there was a moment where I was like, I got to get out of here. I got to get on a plane to New York and I got to just start my life. And that's kind of what happens with the character. And I needed things to happen that got her into that mindset as I was put into that mindset. And so that was one of them. We also had a situation similar in our family with something that we had. And, my parents made some decisions and then lied about it. And we eventually just found out the truth. And I think that that happens with all families and all parents. But it, it, I think the part of writing that I discovered is you sort of take all these experiences, kind of roll them together, kind of make them salient and narrative, and then that becomes what happens in the book. And is it truth? It's a combination of truths, but that was something that I discovered, and I know a lot of writers do that on a daily basis. But for me, I was just like, oh, I can take 4 or 5 stories and turn them into this story, and that feels really empowering.
For sure. There's an interesting, well, there's several points in the book where you focus in on different characters
Yeah,
and tell a bit of their backstory or insight into who they are, but via different mediums.
right.
So we get Dawn in a manual, like an office place manual. We get
Right.
Annie Marie as paper dolls. We get Lou as a girls' magazine questionnaire. Tell
Mhm.
me about that decision to use those different communication formats to tell these different parts of the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that comes from a graphic design background. I think that, again, I think they were founded in truthful things. I never saw my father ever read a book. And yet I can remember him countless times sitting in his chair reading a user's manual of an appliance that we had just got. And he was just somebody that just knew he wanted to know how something worked. He wanted to understand what would he should do if it broke. He wanted to understand how to troubleshoot things. And in terms of talking about who he is and his backstory, I thought, what a better way than to sort of turn him into if he was the appliance, how would you explain to a consumer how do you use this product? Where did this product come from? And then what do you do when it starts to break or have problems? And it was one of those moments. I mean, sometimes you have ideas where you're like, this is genius. And then you start writing, you're like, this isn't genius. And that was one of those ideas that felt really smart and then continued to feel smart as I was making it. And then I look at it now and I'm like, this is a great way to talk about a character. And not only that, it's so representative of my dad. It's so representative of who he was, what were his priorities, how he thought about. I mean, there's something so sobering about a user's manual, and yet there's something in the user's manual that's really heartfelt in terms of like the intention of like, we want this to work, we want you to be happy. And yet it all seemed to hit on every level, and I'm really, really proud of it. So
This story feels like it would have hit differently 15 years ago or 20
sure.
years ago. I think we would have looked at it and said, boy, people were so backwards back then. Uh, in 2026, it feels uh, miserably relevant. Do is this just the story you've always wanted to tell or felt you needed to tell, or did this story emerge from the political times we're living in?
Maybe a little bit of both. I think the majority of it, it was the story that I wanted to tell because I knew it. I know that when I pitched this idea to an agent, and it's when I had a first chapter and a synopsis, the agent said, we like this story, but we think that the AIDS storyline is pretty, you know, it's just not something a modern reader would want to read about. So we'd prefer it if the girl was non-binary or trans and the guy had COVID. And I just thought that's not the story. I can't write that story and I don't want to write that story. And I stumbled across an agent who became my agent who basically said, "Look, what's different is what you're passionate about and what's different is what makes it special. And your passion comes through in the story that you want to tell." And so I guess the lesson that I learned was, believe in the story that you want to tell, and somehow or another, look, if something is happening in the world that you can sort of, lean into and be like, here are some connections that's happening in the world right now. Because publishing takes so long, who knows what, in 2020, who knows what's going to happen 5 years from now. So it's hard to say I'm going to make this really relevant because the minute you do, it's all out of date. But it is a wonderful happy accident when you're talking about the lack of kindness in the world, and suddenly you're picking up a headline and being like, "There's a lack of kindness in the world." So it was not my intention, but I certainly am welcoming the connection to what's happening in the world today.
Yeah, it's really a book about empathy, and as
Right.
much as I've been saying, oh, I was reading it with tears in my eyes. A lot of the times I was reading it because of the sad aspects of it, but it was also the beautiful demonstrations of caring and kindness
Hmm.
and empathy that
Thank you for saying that. That's great. That's I mean, again, that's so lovely to hear. I can't even tell you how lovely that is to hear.
Well, needless to say, I absolutely loved the book. Thought it was
Great.
fantastic. What have you got on the horizon as you move towards launch date? Is it just promotional activities? Are you thinking about the next book? Where are you at as an artist?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I sold this book about a year and a half ago, and there was a little bit of downtime, and I've started working on something new. It's about it still sort of uses my sister and myself as, touchstones. It's a little bit more memoirish. It's actually the memoir that I wrote, 15 years ago that I put in a drawer and was like, nah, nobody wants this, but suddenly it's making a really interesting graphic novel about a relationship between siblings and how that changes, and and it's a much broader scope. I mean, I think where this book takes place over like 3 or 4 months, that takes place over 4 or 5 decades. So it's it's been a challenge to write something new with similar characters but yet a whole different framework, and I'm super excited to work on it. So yeah.
Fantastic. Well, you mentioned you haven't come from a comic book background,
Right.
and I would just really encourage you. Don't just reach out to the literary community. There is so many people who love superheroes and also love Alison Bechdel,
Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah. No,
who
no,
love
no. I'm
Batman.
learning that.
Yeah, so there's a whole world of people who are going to absolutely love this. Congratulations on the
Thank you
book.
so much.
If people want to learn more about it, if they want to learn about more about you, where should we send them?
I have a website, which is emilwilson.com. Simon and Schuster is a great place to learn more about the book. Um, yeah, those are places. I mean, hopefully it inspires people to like learn about the 80s and AIDS history and graphic novels in general. And, there's plenty of information. I mean, if you like this, there's plenty of places to go from here. But I hope that people really enjoy it. And I'm so excited that and thrilled that you did. So that's great.
I think they will. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join me
Thank you.
on the podcast today.
This has been great. Thank you so much for this.